The dog ran into my yard every morning for 11 months before she ever did. Then one Tuesday in October, the fence gate rusted open at the hinge, and instead of the dog trotting through it alone the way he always had, she followed him in, barefoot, hair still damp from a shower, checking me for a threat before she checked him for one. I knew, before either of us said a word, that something had just shifted that couldn't shift back. I just didn't understand yet what she'd been running from for 11 months, or why it had taken a rusted hinge to end it. My name is Dean Ashford. I'm 33. I teach woodshop at the high school 2 miles from my house, which means I spend my days explaining to 16-year-olds why a chisel is not a screwdriver, and my evenings in a yard that's too big for one person and one very determined visiting dog. I live alone in a house I inherited from my grandfather, with a workshop out back that I've slowly filled with more tools than furniture, and I've made peace with both facts. My last relationship ended 2 years ago, quietly, the kind of ending where neither of us bothered to be dramatic about it, and since then I'd settled into a life that ran on routines I liked well enough not to question. Coffee at 6, the workshop by 7, a dog showing up around the same time every morning like clockwork I never had to wind. Her name was Sadie Vaughn. She worked night shifts in the ER, the kind of job that left her running on the specific tired that never fully resets, the kind where a full night's sleep becomes a rumor rather than a plan. She carried a steel thermos so dented it looked like it had survived a small war, wore her hair in a bun that gave up sometime around hour 10 of every shift, and never apologized for texting me at 6 in the morning about a dog that technically wasn't even supposed to be in my yard in the first place. Her texts were never more than a sentence. Coming to get him. Sorry again. 5 minutes. She never wasted a word on me, and for 11 months I told myself that was just efficiency, and nothing more. The dog's name was Wallace, a scruffy, low-slung cattle dog mix with one ear that never stood upright, and an escape talent that would have been impressive if it weren't so consistent. He came through the same gap in the fence every morning, like it was a scheduled commute, flopped down in the sun by my porch steps, and waited to be walked back home by whichever of us got there first. Usually it was me. Sadie usually sent a text instead of coming herself, which was how we'd managed to be neighbors for a full year without ever actually standing in the same yard at the same time. I used to joke to myself that I knew her better through her punctuation than I would ever know her in person. The clipped periods, the total absence of exclamation points, the way even her thank yous read like they'd been rationed. I told myself I didn't mind hosting the dog because I like dogs generally as a category. That is hiding with better branding. The morning everything changed started the way most of them did. Grass still wet, the specific mineral smell of dew burning off in early sun, a distant lawnmower somewhere 2 streets over, Wallace already sitting on my porch steps like he owned the deed to the place. Most mornings I'd bring him a bowl of water, sit on the step for a few minutes doing absolutely nothing productive, and wait for the inevitable text. It was, if I was honest with myself, the best 10 minutes of most of my days, and I had never once let myself examine why that was true. Except this time he wasn't just sitting there waiting. He was chewing on something dark and crumbled that he'd clearly found near the property line, where I'd put down fresh mulch the day before, without checking what kind the hardware store had actually sold me. I knew enough about dogs and enough about cocoa mulch to feel my stomach drop before I'd even finished pulling it out of his mouth. I texted the number on his collar tag instead of waiting for her usual message, which had never happened before in 11 months of this arrangement, and called it 30 seconds later when she didn't answer fast enough for my liking. She picked up mid-shift, voice flat with exhaustion and instantly sharp with fear once I explained why I was calling. She couldn't leave the floor. I could hear machines beeping behind her, someone paging a doctor, the particular controlled chaos of a hospital at 6 in the morning. She gave me the emergency vet's address in 4 clipped sentences and told me, in a voice that cracked exactly once, to please just get him there. That crack was the first thing that sat wrong. In a way I didn't have a name for yet. I drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand keeping Wallace still in the passenger seat, telling him with more sincerity than I usually reserved for anyone that he was going to be fine, mostly because saying it out loud seemed to help me more than him. The vet clinic smelled like antiseptic and stress, all fluorescent light and hard plastic chairs, and I sat in one of them for 2 hours with a dog's leash wrapped twice around my hand, because letting go of it felt, unreasonably, like letting go of something bigger. I hadn't examined why that mattered so much. I told myself it was just the adrenaline talking, the same way you'd worry over any animal you'd spent 11 months half adopting through a gap in a fence. People get sentimental during emergencies. It doesn't mean anything. I thought about the 11 months before that morning, every text that arrived exactly the length of a shrug, every time I told myself I was simply being a considerate neighbor to a woman who clearly wanted nothing more from me than a place to store an escape artist dog for 10 minutes at a time. I'd built an entire personality around not minding the distance, and sitting in that plastic chair with her leash still wrapped around my hand, I understood exactly how much of that personality had been a story I told myself, because the truth was inconvenient on a schedule that ran on one-sentence texts. That excuse held up for about as long as it took Suddy to walk through the clinic doors 4 hours later, still in scrubs, thermos abandoned somewhere, hair fully escaped from its bun. She didn't ask about herself. She didn't sit down. She went straight to the exam room window and pressed her hand flat against the glass, like that would somehow speed up the antidote working. And something about the specific desperation in that gesture told me this was not, in fact, just about a dog. I have poor survival instincts around women who look at anything like their whole world is behind that glass. I brought her a cup of vending machine coffee she didn't ask for and didn't touch, and sat with her in silence, because it was clearly the only useful thing I had to offer. The vet came out an hour later and told us Wallace would be fine. He caught it early. The dose was small. They'd keep him overnight for monitoring and send him home by tomorrow evening. Sadie sat down hard in the chair next to mine, like her legs had simply stopped being consulted on the decision. And for the first time in 11 months, she didn't reach for her phone to end the conversation early. The evidence didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, the way it always does once you finally stopped looking away. The first piece was the leash still wrapped around my hand. It had a small wooden tag on it, hand-carved, Wallace burned crooked into one side with a rough little paw shape next to it. Clearly not store-bought, and clearly not recent. I asked, mostly to fill the silence, who'd made it. She went very still, not dramatically, just still, before she said, quietly, that her brother had. The second piece came out slower, the way the real things always do. Her brother Cole had gotten Wallace as a rescue 2 years ago, back when he still lived 3 streets over, and still texted her every morning about nothing in particular. He died in an accident 14 months ago. She'd kept the dog because giving him up felt like admitting the last living piece of her brother's daily rhythm was allowed to end too. She'd never fixed the gate, she said, staring at the vending machine like it owed her an explanation, because some mornings the only proof she had that any of it had been real was a dog showing up somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, exactly the way her brother used to. I have poor survival instincts around people who hand me their grief disguised as small talk about a fence. I didn't say anything clever. I just let the silence hold what it needed to hold. The third piece was smaller, and somehow worse. She admitted, almost as an aside, that she'd known for months the gate could be fixed with about $11 of hardware and 20 minutes of effort, and that she'd driven past the hardware store at least 6 times without stopping. Not because she was careless. Because fixing it felt like a door closing on something she wasn't ready to close. There was a piece in between those two I almost missed. Because she delivered it so flatly, it took a second to register as significant at all. She mentioned that in the years since Cole died, she'd let exactly 3 people past the outer layer of her: her mother, her charge nurse, and, as of approximately 4 hours ago, and entirely against her own better judgment, me. She said it like a joke. Her hands, wrapped tight around a paper cup gone cold an hour earlier, said it wasn't one. The 4th piece happened without a single word. She fell asleep in the plastic chair beside me, somewhere around hour 6, her head tipping slowly sideways until it landed against my shoulder, and she didn't wake up when I shifted to make it easier for her. 11 months of a woman who never gave me more than one clipped sentence at a time. And here she was, unguarded, trusting a near stranger with the entire dead weight of a double shift, grief-flattened body. That landed harder than anything she'd said out loud all night. The 5th piece I noticed only because I was looking for a way to stay still without waking her. Her phone, face up on her knee, lit up twice with a name saved as Mom Do Not Call Before Noon. And a 3rd time with a text from a number saved simply as Cole's landlord, some loose end about a storage unit, still unresolved 14 months later, still apparently too much to deal with. I looked away before I could read more of it than that. Some evidence you don't need a second piece of to understand the whole picture. After that, we didn't talk for a while. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the opposite. The kind of quiet that only happens when 2 people have run out of small talk and haven't found the nerve for the real thing yet. The clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a dog barked once and settled. I stayed as still as I could manage so I wouldn't wake her, watching the parking lot lighten slowly through the window, thinking about 11 months of one-sentence texts and how completely they'd failed to prepare me for the size of what was apparently underneath them. A nurse walked past with a chart under her arm and gave us the specific look reserved for exhausted people who'd clearly been there all night, and I found myself wondering, absurdly, whether Sadie recognized that look from the other side of it on a nightly basis. I thought about the porch light I left on some nights out of nothing more than habit, and about how many mornings I'd caught myself glancing at the fence line before I'd even made coffee, hoping for a dog I told myself I merely tolerated. I thought about how thin that story had always been, and how it had taken exactly one bad batch of mulch to knock it over completely. She woke an hour before visiting hours started, disoriented for exactly 1 second before she remembered where she was, and pulled back with an apology already halfway out of her mouth. I told her she didn't need to apologize for falling asleep. She said that wasn't what she was apologizing for. She sat up straighter, rubbed both hands over her face like she could physically reset herself, and looked at the leash still looped around my hand instead of at me. The wooden tag caught the light for a second. Wallace, crooked and small. The little paw shape worn soft at the edges from a year of handling. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The waiting room television played the news on mute in the corner, and somewhere behind the desk a phone rang twice and stopped. She was the one who finally said something true. It came out sideways, the way her real things always did. "I've been sending Wallace back through that gap on purpose for months," she said, looking at her hands instead of me. "Not because I forgot to fix it. Because some mornings you were the only reason I got out of bed before a shift, to go get the dog, to have one small errand that meant seeing another person's face. I hated that I needed that. I hate small talk. I don't hate whatever this apparently is." That landed. Not loudly. Just completely. I filed that under things I would be thinking about at 3 in the morning for the rest of my life, then said something about the coffee machine to buy myself a second before I said anything true myself. My hand tightened once around the leash. I looked away first, which had never once happened to me in a conversation with her. In 11 months of conversations that mostly consisted of one clipped sentence and a closing door. I started leaving the porch light on every night, I told her, in case he came through late instead of at his usual time. I told myself that was just responsible dog-adjacent behavior. It wasn't. I've been in love with the version of my mornings that included you showing up for a dog for longer than I want to admit, and I never once had the nerve to fix the gate myself either. She looked up at that, held my gaze 1 second longer than felt safe, the way she'd never once let herself do in 11 months of clipped morning texts, and let the silence answer for her. You don't have to say anything else, I told her. We can call this an emergency vet visit and go back to one-sentence texts about a dog, if that's easier. She didn't take the door I'd left open. She didn't move. Her fingers tightened once around the empty coffee cup, then let it go entirely, setting it down on the chair between us like she needed both hands free for whatever came next. Every man I've dated since Cole died felt like an interruption, she said. You never did. You just kept being the guy at the end of the yard who fed my brother's dog and never once made me explain why that mattered so much. I don't know what to call that yet. I know I don't want it to stop. Something in my chest shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. My hand found hers on the plastic armrest between our chairs. Not fast, not uncertain, just decided. And for a moment neither of us said anything else, because nothing else needed saying. The vet tech chose that exact moment to push through the door and announce, entirely too cheerfully for 6 in the morning, that Wallace was awake, asking for someone. And, her exact words, extremely offended about the whole situation. We both laughed, the real kind, the kind that is nowhere left to hide, and went in together to collect a dog who had, without meaning to, spent 11 months quietly building a bridge between two people too guarded to build it themselves. Weeks later, the gate finally got fixed. New hinge, new latch. 20 minutes and $11 of hardware, exactly like she'd known all along. Wallace's morning commute officially ended. He still came anyway, just through the actual gate now, with Sadie 1 step behind him, instead of a text message 2 hours later. She started leaving her thermos on my counter overnight, which I noticed and didn't mention, and she noticed me noticing, and didn't mention that either. We were both, it turned out, fluent in saying things without saying them. And for once that was working in our favor instead of against it. 3 months after that, the wooden tag on his leash got a second line burned into it. My handwriting this time, matching the crooked lettering as closely as I could manage. A small line that just said the good boy, which was Sadie's private nickname for him, and which she cried about for exactly 4 minutes before pretending she hadn't. I didn't point out that I'd noticed. Some things you let a person have. She started coming by after her shifts, even on mornings the dog stayed home, curling into the corner of my couch still in scrubs, asleep before her coffee got cold half the time. I learned to work around a sleeping woman the way I'd once learned to work around a sleeping dog, quietly, carefully, rearranging my whole morning without ever once resenting the inconvenience of it. A year later, the porch light stayed on every night out of actual habit instead of hope, and Sadie kept a spare thermos at my place because hers never survived a full week without a dent. Wallace slept between us most nights, taking up more space than any one dog reasonably should, and neither of us ever once suggested moving him. She finally cleared out her brother's storage unit that spring and asked me to help carry the boxes, which felt like the kind of trust that doesn't get handed out twice in a lifetime. let alone once. Years later, when people ask how we met, I tell them it started with a dog and a bad batch of mulch. Sadie always adds the real part herself, that she'd been quietly grieving her brother through that fence gap for over a year before either of us said one honest word about it, and that the accident with the mulch hadn't started anything. It had just finally run out of patience for both of us, pretending a dog was the only reason she kept coming back. Nothing important had appeared overnight. It had simply stopped hiding. Wallace, for what it's worth, remains entirely unrepentant about the mulch, the fence, and every other minor disaster he's caused since. Mostly because he has no idea he's the reason any of this happened at all. So, what would you have done, sitting in a vet clinic waiting room at 6 a.m. with someone else's grief finally spilling into the open? And has there ever been someone whose small, repeated presence in your life turned out to be carrying something so much heavier than either of you let on? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.